You're watching Eerie Escapes.
My name is Lucas, and from the moment I arrived in the eerily quiet town of Marsh Harbor, eyes hollow from old fears watched my every move. My only refuge in this isolating landscape was the aged, brittle Mrs. Bales, a kindly yet haunting presence, whose house clung to a past as weathered as its wooden beams. Her tea, steeped as much in bitter herbs as in worn-out stories, left an indelible mark on my senses. It was when the tale of the Marsh Harbor beast unfurled from her lips, I realized I'd stepped into a narrative of eerie legends, a world far removed from the one I'd known, and there was no turning back. Intriguing peculiarities and enigmas of existence have always fascinated me. The facets of life that exist beyond the ordinary, the mundane. I found solace in the uncanny, the bizarre, the inexplicable mysteries that this world harbored. However, I had no idea this peculiar fascination of mine would steer me towards an adventure, a journey that led to a chilling encounter in the ominous town of Marsh Harbor. Marsh Harbor, a town veiled in a dense fog of enigma, was known for its dilapidated structures and uncanny quietude that blanketed its landscape. Decades-old tales of mystery surrounding the town had created a chilling lore. Stories whispered by the locals spoke of a terrifying curse that had befallen them, a monstrous creature that lurked in the shadows, feeding off their fears. Accounts of whole families vanishing into the thin air without a trace, innocent livestock ruthlessly mutilated, and chilling, inhuman howls that pierced through the otherwise silent, cold nights made Marsh Harbor infamous. And as a dedicated investigative journalist, it was my solemn duty to pierce through these fantastical tales and uncover the reality. With her gaze fixated into the distance, as if she was looking beyond the material world and into the realm of forgotten horrors, Mrs. Bales began her narrative in a voice barely above a whisper. She spoke as though the very walls around us could hear. "The beast," she said. "It savors fear just as much as it relishes flesh, my dear." Her hand, cold and bony, tightly gripped mine, the chilling touch serving as a stark reminder of the terror she lived with. There was a certain desperation in her tone that struck a chord in my heart. She continued, her voice shaking. "You need to know it has a way of sniffing out your fear. It draws the beast closer." She further detailed the horrifying characteristics of the beast, painting a grim picture that would terrify the bravest of hearts. It was as if she was sharing an ancient folklore, a terrifying lore of Marsh Harbor passed down generations, a lore that had become their haunting reality. "The Marsh Harbor beast is no ordinary creature," Mrs. Bales elaborated, her voice dropping to a haunted whisper. "It possesses a disturbing intelligence and cunning. It's not like any wild beast that hunts for survival. It hunts for pleasure. It feeds on our terror, finds joy in our despair. The more frightened you are, the more it relishes its hunt." She spoke of its size, bigger than any animal native to their region, its form cloaked in the darkness of the night, of its haunting eyes luminescent in the pitch-black night, which seemed to pierce the very soul of its victim, of its horrifying howls that sliced through the silence of the town, making their blood run cold, a chilling symphony that forebode doom. The tale that Mrs. Bales shared wasn't just an account of a terrifying beast. It was a disturbing insight into a town haunted by fear, a community living in the shadow of a monster. Her story, much like the taste of her oversteeped tea, was bitter, potent, and lingering, a chilling tale that added a new layer of dread to my stay in Marsh Harbor. After a restless night tormented by dread and apprehension, I woke up to a horrifying reality. A family, the Kirkpatricks, had seemingly vanished into thin air. The father, the town's beloved baker, and his two innocent young daughters were gone without a trace. Their house bore silent witness to a brutal struggle, a shattered window, an eerie silence, and the most unsettling sight of a child's doll lying in a pool of a sinister dark fluid, too reminiscent of blood. A cold shiver ran down my spine, realization sinking in with a terrifying intensity. Subsequent nights transformed into a living nightmare, a blur of sleepless hours haunted by the terror that this beast instilled. The beast's terrifying howls, growing louder with each passing night, orchestrated a symphony of fear that echoed through the darkness. The days offered no respite. The once flourishing and vibrant community of Marsh Harbor was crumbling, suffocating under the heavy burden of fear and despair, its heartbeat faltering night after night. On the 7th night since my arrival, the cries of the beast took on an eerily different tone. They were closer, more personal. Cold beads of sweat trickled down my forehead. My pulse quickened. My heart pounded like a war drum in my ears. Peering out the window, I saw it in the dim light of the moon, a monstrous figure shrouded by the darkness. It was large, moved with a predatory agility that sent shivers down my spine. Its eyes, glowing with an unholy light in the pitch black, seemed to be staring directly at me, as if I was the chosen prey for the night. The fear that washed over me was paralyzing. I was frozen in place, unable to run, to hide, or to voice my terror. My impending doom was at my doorstep, and all I could do was await its arrival. And then, everything went black. At first, the events of that terrifying night were shrouded in a veil of obscurity, an impenetrable darkness in my memory. The mere recollection of those sinister, glowing eyes, as haunting as they were enigmatic, was the only fragment of that night that I could remember. It felt as if my mind had constructed a formidable fortress, barricading itself from the rest of the horror. Gradually, as consciousness made its return, I found myself enveloped by an environment that was sterile and foreign, devoid of the familiar comforts that I was accustomed to. A hospital. I was alone, the stark fluorescent lights bouncing off the pristine white walls, their clinical coldness only accentuating my feeling of unease. A doctor, his face as sterile as his surroundings, informed me about my inexplicable state. He told me that I had been found unconscious, lying motionless at the outskirts of Marsh Harbor. His voice was a steady monotone, each word carefully calculated, devoid of emotion, as he broke the news to me. The possibility of my experiences being hallucinations due to an overworked mind and severe insomnia was put forth. It felt as if my quest for the truth had taken a bizarre, unexpected turn. However, with each passing day and the slow, relentless march of time, the heavy fog clouding my memory started to lift. The memories, initially just vague silhouettes lurking in the dark corners of my mind, began emerging into the light. It was as if they had been waiting, biding their time before they resurfaced from the depths of my subconscious. Faint whispers of the terror I experienced slowly grew louder, like an old record player gradually cranking up its volume. The chilling howls that echoed through the night, the paralyzing fear, the monstrous figure, and those terrifying glowing eyes. All of it started flooding back piece by piece, forming a disturbing mosaic of the nightmare that was my encounter at Marsh Harbor. The amorphous dread started to take a discernible form, my encounters with the townsfolk, the oversteeped tea, and the haunting tale of Mrs. Bales. It was all coming back, seeping into my consciousness like dark ink spreading through water. The labyrinth of my memories was no longer a mystery. It was a terror I had lived and was now being forced to relive. Every night when the moon reigns in the sky and the world is plunged into a deep slumber, I still hear the cries of the beast. They call out to me, tugging me back to the haunted memories of Marsh Harbor. The beast isn't finished with me yet, leaving me to ponder. Will I ever break free from the chains of this psychological terror? Will I ever be liberated from the dreadful curse of Marsh Harbor? Only time will tell. But until then, the echo of the beast's cries haunts me, lingering in the darkness of the night and the recesses of my tormented mind.
My story begins as one might expect for a 7-year-old girl, innocent and wide-eyed. I lived in a house that felt as old as time itself, filled with the relics of forgotten generations and intriguing mysteries. One such mystery was an old toy I stumbled upon one day, hidden away in a drawer filled with odds and ends. The toy, battered and worn, held an irresistible charm, its aura pulling me into its enigmatic world. "Hello," I greeted it, my childish mind unaware of the extraordinary journey that was about to begin. Who would have thought that a simple toy could talk? I certainly didn't. But it did. Living next door was Mrs. Baxter, our kind-hearted yet mysterious elderly neighbor. She always had a watchful eye on me, her piercing gaze noticing even the smallest of my actions. I noticed her concern too, but failed to grasp its significance at that tender age. And my mother, well, she was too consumed by her own world of worries and exhaustion to notice my increasing attachment to the toy. I christened it the Playmate. Innocent enough for a 7-year-old, but as the whispers began, the name started to carry a certain ominous weight. The playmate began to talk to me, its voice an indistinct murmur at first, but gradually turning into a siren call that I found myself irresistibly drawn to. I would lie awake at night, listening to the whispers that continued to haunt my dreams, gradually painting my world in their uncanny hue. One day, my mother asked me, concern lining her features, "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I merely smiled back at her, my innocent heart unable to comprehend her concern. My friend. Under the influence of the playmate, I began to embark on precarious adventures. It led me to discover hidden corners of our property and into the unknown. I was drawn into its captivating world, embarking on dangerous games that only seemed exciting to my young mind. Like that chilling evening when I found myself at the edge of the deep well in our backyard, the darkness below beckoning me. If not for Mrs. Baxter's timely intervention, I fear I would have succumbed to the alluring call of the abyss. As the days passed, it became apparent that Mrs. Baxter knew more about the playmate than she initially let on. One evening, she presented an old newspaper clipping, a relic from the past that bore the story of a young boy who had met an untimely end. The boy, she explained, was the previous owner of the toy, and his restless spirit was now trapped within it. My mother was skeptical, her disbelief mirrored in her eyes, yet something in her stirred, a maternal instinct perhaps, urging her to believe the unbelievable. The whispers became more intense as the days went by, turning frantic, desperate. Each word felt like a tether, pulling me further into the playmate's realm. But what I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning of a series of events that would lead me on a path filled with twists and turns, a path that would test the limits of my courage and resolve, shattering my childhood innocence. With the whispers from the playmate growing more frenzied and urgent, my everyday reality became a tightrope walk between innocence and a malevolent, unseen force. The playmate's influence was like an invisible hand guiding me to the precipice of danger, its voice an echo in my dreams, and its presence a constant shadow by my side. One day, the playmate led me into the woods behind our house, a place my mother had always cautioned me to avoid. Its whispers promised an adventure, something thrilling and compelling. Guided by its voice, I journeyed deeper and deeper into the woods until I found myself standing in front of a dilapidated house, hidden within the thick canopy of trees. There was an eerie sense of familiarity about the house. The playmate's whispers grew louder, almost ecstatic. "Go inside," it urged. I remember feeling a knot of fear in my stomach, but I was a child led by the hand of curiosity, and I pushed open the creaking door. The house was as forgotten on the inside as it was on the outside, but as I ventured further, I stumbled upon a room filled with old toys, just like the playmate. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized this must have been the young boy's room, the boy whose spirit was now trapped within my toy. The playmate's voice reached a crescendo, urging me to pick up another toy from the floor. A sense of dread washed over me, but it was then I realized I had to make a stand. Fear coursed through me, but courage and resolve also began to surface. I could hear Mrs. Baxter's voice in my head, reminding me that I had the power to resist, to say no. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it was enough. I felt the playmate's influence wavering, its desperate pleas turning into frustrated growls. I dropped the playmate and backed away, moving towards the door. That day marked the beginning of my resistance against the playmate. I began to realize that its power over me was only as strong as I allowed it to be. Each day became a battle, a test of my courage and resolve. It wasn't easy. Many times I found myself succumbing to its influence, only to be saved in the nick of time by Mrs. Baxter or my mother. But with each confrontation, my resistance grew stronger, my will harder. One night, the playmate's whispers turned into screams, its fury and frustration reverberating through the silence of the house. I was terrified, but I was also angry. I confronted it, screaming back at it to stop. The room grew eerily silent. The playmate's voice was gone. I remember clutching my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribcage. My childhood innocence was shattered, replaced by a newfound strength. But my battle with the playmate was far from over, and the path to ridding myself of its influence would be laden with further challenges and trials. Following that confrontation, the playmate went silent for a few days. The respite was both calming and unnerving. I wondered if I'd won, but deep down, I knew the battle was far from over. Then one rainy evening, its voice returned, more enticing than ever. "Let's play, Anna," it beckoned, inviting me back into its unsettling world. I felt a chill, but I held my ground, refusing to answer. In the days that followed, the playmate started to manipulate the environment around me. Toys would move on their own, doors would open and close, and lights would flicker without reason. It even tried to project the boy's image, a mirage-like vision, hoping to evoke sympathy or fear. But with each uncanny display, I felt my courage strengthening. As weeks turned into months, my mother and Mrs. Baxter began to notice the change in me. I was no longer the carefree, naive girl who had initially discovered the toy. Now I was a child who had seen and experienced things most adults never would. I was growing up far too fast, and that brought a different kind of concern in their eyes. One day, Mrs. Baxter came to our house with a small bag of salt and a couple of aged books. She said it was time to cleanse the toy and free the boy's spirit. I remember the fear that clutched my heart at the thought of confronting the playmate again, but I knew I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. We sat in a circle, with the playmate in the center, the air around us thick with apprehension. Mrs. Baxter began chanting words from an old incantation, her voice steady and resolute. My mother held my hand, her grip firm yet comforting. The playmate began to react violently. The whispers turned into screams, echoing around the room, chilling us to the bone. The toy levitated, shaking violently in the air, but I did not back down. "You can't control me anymore!" I shouted at it, my voice reverberating against the walls of our old house. And then, with one final shriek, the toy fell to the ground, lifeless and ordinary. My mother, Mrs. Baxter, and I sat there, staring at the silent toy. It was over. We'd won. In the aftermath, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I put the toy away after stripping it of its evil influence, and vowed never to let anything control me ever again. The memory of the playmate has never truly left me. I had to grow up too quickly, and my childhood innocence was irrevocably lost. But through it all, I found a courage I never knew I had, and a resolve that would steel me against future adversities. That's all for now. However, we extend an invitation, wrapped in the cloak of intrigue, for you to join us as we journey into realms of deliciously spine-chilling exploits. So, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, please subscribe now. Thanks, and see you next time. That's all for now. However, we extend